Sheriff Coates, we'd be honored to recognize you, sir. Welcome to our committee, and we'll let you present, and then you'll stay for questions, and then you have looks like you have ample backup back there should you need help.
Yes, we do. We come well armed.
The funny choice of words today.
Yeah. Well, good morning, members, and first of all, I want to report to you that the Florida Sheriff's Association, without question, supports the Second Amendment constitutional rights to bear arms and encourages responsible citizens to obtain concealed weapons permit and legally possess firearms and carry them in an authorized concealed manner. Going back to Representative Swartz's comment earlier, why do we need this bill or this law? And that's my question too, Representative. What's the problem? What's the issue? I understand it's about people's rights, but people's rights need to be granted in a responsible way for the right reasons. And I know we've heard some discussion about brandishing weapons or accidentally displaying weapons that are concealed. And I cannot find a case anywhere where anybody was arrested in the state of Florida for that violation. And perhaps it's just law enforcement using good common sense if they are confronted with such a situation or receive such a complaint. The Florida Sheriff's Association is concerned that allowing legal concealed weapon permit holders to openly wear firearms will increase critical minutes between identifying individuals with potential criminal intent versus lawful citizens with a legal firearm. Criminals will be able to use this delay and uncertainty to their advantage. We have concerns what might happen at retail stores and public venues, particularly large public venues, as was previously described by the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. Parades in public areas, large gatherings. And I tell you what really concerns me is when law enforcement officers arrive to a scene or a call for service or disturbance or whatever, and they encounter somebody who, if this bill passes, is legally carrying, openly carrying a firearm, poses great challenges for law enforcement. And I will tell you that with all the other law enforcement shootings that we've been experiencing here for the last year or so, we just had 2 more last week or within this last week in other states, law enforcement is going to be on high alert. And when they arrive at a scene and they see somebody openly carrying, their attention is going to be focused to that individual or individuals. And I will dare say, and I can't blame them for this, law enforcement is going to be drawing down on these folks until they neutralize the threat or make sure the individual is not a threat or a risk, because they don't want to put themselves at great risk. And I don't blame them until they determine for sure what the exposure is and what the risk is. So that's a real concern that I have. And if this bill passes and if that occurs, I hope the public bears with us and understands law enforcement concerns. Because I'm confident. I don't want this to happen, but I'm confident it's going to happen, that law enforcement is going to start drawing their weapons and challenging these individuals, and something bad may very well happen. And I just ask that you take that in consideration if you are considering supporting this bill. Again, Florida Sheriff's Association is adamantly opposed to this legislation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sheriff Coates. And I think we have questions. Representative McBurney will start. Anybody else with questions will get Missy's attention. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to be fair, I'll ask you the same question that I asked Representative Dorworth. In the 43 states which have apparently adopted similar legislation, was there an increase in safety issues or problems when those laws were adopted in those similar states?
I don't know. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I'm sure every state law is a little bit different. They may have different restrictions, different places that you can carry openly, such as public events or parades. Maybe they prohibit them from carrying them in retail establishments. each state has its own law, and what I'm really concerned about is the transition time. If this does become law, is people getting accustomed to this. And again, I don't support the law or the bill, but I think it's going to be very difficult for law enforcement and the public, the retailers too, and the citizens, to transition to this concept. And people are going to be on edge. Law enforcement is going to be on edge. And it's going to be some scary times for us and the citizens. I know I didn't directly answer your question, but each state is different. Each has its own restrictions.
Representative Eisnagel for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here this morning. I was just wondering, in the 43 states that have some form of open carry already, have you seen increased instances of law enforcement officers, as you put it, drawing down on citizens who were open carrying their weapons?
I don't know if there's been an increase or not, but I suspect they went through the same. Those other states went through the same transition that, if this bill passes, that we will be going through. And I don't keep track of what other states are doing in this regard.
Follow-up?
Follow-up.
So you just don't know either way?
No, I do not.
One more follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
You recognize.
Have you consulted with law enforcement in any of those other 43 states to see how they handle open carry and if they've had any problems?
You recognize.
I have not done that research.
Representative Soto, you recognize.
Thank you, Sheriff, for coming today. Understanding the detention issue, don't concealed weapons pose an even greater threat to law enforcement because you can't see them?
You recognize.
Okay, not really, in my view. I think it's just that open fear and intimidation. I know if I was responding to a call of an armed robbery at a convenience store or some other event, driving through the neighborhood and saw a disturbance, and I got out to investigate, and I saw one or more individuals openly carrying a gun, I'm immediately going to draw my attention to those individuals and take whatever appropriate action is necessary. And it could be drawing my weapon and drawing down on those individuals and hold them at gun bay until I got backup so that I felt safe and comfortable, and those individuals did not pose a risk to me.
Follow-up.
We had changed the castle doctrine a couple of years ago from the duty to retreat even in your own home to now being able to stand your ground in a public place if you're threatened. And a lot of these same arguments came up before about incidents. Did we see any changes in violence or in crimes as a result of the change in the castle doctrine?
I don't know that we saw, I'm sorry again, I don't know that we saw changes in violence other than people defending themselves in their homes. And we had a recent case in Pinellas County last week, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, where that exact same thing occurred, a legal, justifiable homicide.
Representative Porth for question.
Sheriff, you may have heard Mr. Miller from the Retail Federation come up with some narrowly drafted language concerning brandishing if somebody's jacket lifts up and a gun is seen. Is that language that you could live with?
Absolutely.
We had some. Okay, Representative Harrison, you're recognized for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sheriff Coates, could you just explain for me, because I do not, I'm a gun owner, but I do not have a concealed weapons permit. What sort of training is involved in taking that class, and what do you learn about carrying a concealed weapon versus how would that training be different from the training that law enforcement personnel go through in carrying an open weapon?
Sheriff, I'm going to make it easy for you. Just answer the question.
Okay. Sir, the training that law enforcement goes through is very, very extensive, and I think it was about 40 hours of firearms training. And not only the actual training, the shooting the weapon itself and the safe handling of the weapon and the holster retention or firearms retention and things like that, but also the legal aspects of the use of firearms and things like that. And in the concealed weapons permit is a very limited amount of training, basically you're firing a few shots downrange, and you spend some time on safely handling firearms, the safe handling of firearms, and the legal aspects of carrying a concealed weapons permit. But the training that law enforcement receives is far more extensive than the carrying a concealed firearms permit training.
Okay. Representative Steinberg for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Sheriff, for being here. Are you concerned that this will create an increase in the volume of calls you may receive? For example, perhaps someone's walking down open carrying who has a concealed weapons permit and is doing it lawfully, but someone who sees them doesn't realize that's the law or doesn't know whether they are lawfully carrying and now calls 911. Do you think that's going to cause an increase in calls, and how would you guys have to deal with those?
I do think it will cause an increase in calls, primarily, as I said earlier, if this does become law, as we go through this transition and people are allowed to open carry. Not all citizens are going to be aware that this is, legally safe to do now, or legally permissible to do. And certainly law enforcement will be receiving calls for service. And in those types of calls, those are priority one calls, it's going to require I would say a minimum 2 or more law enforcement officers to respond to these types of calls.
Follow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And even after a learning curve, even after the community knows that that's the law, if you receive a phone call that says someone's walking down the street with a gun in a holster and the person is concerned about it, is law enforcement going to have to respond and inquire as to whether or not that person has a license?
Law enforcement will probably respond, and I will tell you that would depend on the circumstances and the location or the environment in which that individual is carrying. If that individual is walking down a country road somewhere, that might be a different thing. If that individual is walking around openly carrying at 2 a.m. in the morning in a residential area, that's going to require a number of law enforcement resources to respond to.
Follow.
One last follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if there are other calls that are in the bank, in a sense, or calls that are waiting, will that take priority over those other calls and affect the response to other calls for service?
Most likely, yes.
Representative Metz for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sheriff, first of all, thank you for your testimony and for your public service, sir. We appreciate that. I want to return to your testimony about the assumption that if the bill passes and your deputies were to observe someone openly carrying a firearm, that you would draw down on them. Currently, sir, if your deputies observe someone carrying a concealed weapon and assuming no other suspicious behavior except they can tell because they're trained and they see someone's packing, let's say, do they draw down on them now?
Normally, no, but it would depend on the circumstances in which that observation occurred.
Okay. Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Follow.
Wouldn't the reasonable suspicion standards still apply either if someone's suspected of or observed to be carrying a concealed weapon or if they were to openly carry under this bill if passed before you could take a step such as drawing down?
Well, I think you have to go back to the environment in which that observation is made. And again, I can only place myself in a deputy's or a law enforcement officer's position when they encounter, in the environment in which they encounter or make this observation, particularly if they are responding to a call for service, whether it be a disturbance, suspicious activity, or whatever. But when law enforcement is specifically asked to respond to a call for service, whether it be specifically related to an openly carrying a weapon or some other event that warrants law enforcement's attention or intervention, when law enforcement arrives and they see one or more individuals armed, openly carrying, their focus, I mean, it's just nature, and it's the way they're trained to do. Their focus is going to be drawn to those individuals that are carrying their weapons, and they have a responsibility for their own safety to neutralize any potential risk or threats that those individuals may pose. I mean, it's just good common practice, safety, law enforcement responsibility.
One final follow-up,
Follow-up.
Mr. Chair. But if your deputies, if this bill passed and your deputies were called and they just observed someone openly carrying but no other suspicious behavior or circumstances, they're just obviously seeing that the weapon is openly carried, and without more, they would not need to draw down on that
No.
person.
No.
Thank you.